Rain tapped against the windows of Willow Ridge Care Home as if it wanted to be let inside. In room 312, the light was low and steady. The hum of the monitor rose and fell like a small tide. On the bed lay Martha Hale, 80 years old, her hair silver and soft against the pillow. She had not spoken since a stroke took her words 6 months earlier. Her eyes were open, but they floated past faces and voices as if from a distance. Claire Bennett sat in a chair by the bed and held the older woman's hand. She wore grey scrubs and a cardigan the colour of ash. A small radio on the table played a slow guitar tune. Claire hummed along. Her voice was not loud, and it was not polished, but it was warm. It filled the corners of the room that the light could not reach. It was near the end of her shift. She told Martha about the lake behind the facility and how the geese had returned too early. She told her about the branch of a birch tree that scraped the glass when the wind came from the north. She told her that the cafeteria had overcooked the carrots again. She spoke the way people speak to a friend who is tired, calm and simple. A shape paused in the hallway, a tall man in a dark coat with rain still clinging to his hair. He stood a few steps from the door and looked through the small square window. He did not move. Claire lowered the radio and glanced up. Visiting hours had ended, so she rose and opened the door a little. "I am sorry," she said. "We are closed to visitors for the night." He nodded. "I will not be long. Who are you here to see?" He looked past Claire at the bed and at the woman lying still. For a moment his face softened in a way that ached to watch. He swallowed. Then he said almost in a whisper, "I just wanted to hear you sing." He stepped back before she could answer. She watched him walk away down the long white hall, the soles of his shoes wet and quiet. She could have called security, but she did not. There had been no threat in him, only grief. She closed the door and returned to her chair. The rain tapped on. She did not know the man was Thomas Hale Martha's only son. She did not know that he had stood outside this door most weeks for months and had never once gone in. Claire did not plan to be a caregiver. When she was 20, she was an art student at a small college in Ohio. Paint stained her fingers and the sleeves of her sweaters. She spent long nights in a studio that smelled of linseed oil and chalk. She dreamed of gallery shows and paper cups of cheap wine, and ordinary people who stopped in front of her work and stayed longer than they meant to. Then she met Derek. He was older and quick with a smile. He talked about studios in New York and small connections that led to larger ones. Claire believed him because she wanted to. When she told him she was pregnant, he said everything would be fine. One morning he was gone. The cash that Claire had put aside was gone too. In the corner were 3 frames where her finished canvases had been. She stood in the kitchen with her hands on the counter and felt the floor tilt. She dropped out. She moved back to the town where she had grown up. She rented a small apartment with thin walls and a view of a parking lot. She took night shifts at Willow Ridge so that during the day she could care for her daughter Ava. Ava had dark eyes like summer soil and a laugh that was quick to rise. The pay was not much. The work was steady and real. Claire carried a sketchbook in her bag and used it when rooms were quiet. She drew a chipped mug, a curtain loop, a plate of oranges left on a tray. She drew Martha's hands. She drew them again the next night, and the night after learning the map of thin blue veins and small bones. She talked to Martha while she drew. The older woman's eyes tracked nothing. Still, Claire felt as if something in the room listened. One evening the air was heavy with rain. The guitar on the radio stumbled and found its tune again. Claire set the pencil down and leaned closer. At the corner of Martha's right eye, a muscle fluttered. It was a small movement, so small that Claire might have invented it, but her breath caught anyway. She did not press the call button. She did not want to scare the moment away. She smoothed the blanket and told Martha she had finished a drawing of a piano. She told her that tomorrow she would bring it in. Thomas was 9 when his father died in a construction accident. He remembered a long hallway with men in hard hats who did not meet his eyes. He remembered his mother, Martha, sitting very straight at the dining table with a ledger open and a pencil sharp as a needle. She was a piano teacher who believed in metronomes and clean scales. When she smiled, it was neat and brief. She loved him in a way that looked like organization. 3 weeks after the funeral, she drove him to the gates of a boarding school and said, "This is the best place for you." She hugged him, and he stood stiff because he did not know what else to do. She drove away, and he did not cry until it was dark. At school, he learned to control himself. He stayed up late and studied. He learned that it was easier to be the best student than to be the saddest one. The years stacked like folded shirts. He was good at numbers. He was good at plans. He was good at not needing anyone. He built a company in his 30s. It made sensors and software for buildings. He hired smart people and paid them well, and he expected them to keep up. He wore suits that fit, and he shook hands, and he answered emails at 3 in the morning while the city slept. People called him steady and focused. They did not call him kind or unkind. They did not know him well enough. When Martha collapsed in her kitchen, a neighbor found her. Thomas was in Austin signing a large contract. He flew home that night. He paid for the best care. He did not go into room 312. He came to the end of the hallway and stopped. He told himself he would go in next time, then the next time, and the next. He stood there and remembered missing notes that had made his mother tap the piano lid with 2 fingers. He remembered the smell of her perfume and how it meant he was about to be corrected. He remembered birthdays where a card came in the mail with a tender message typed in a careful line and signed Martha as if she were her own secretary. Then he heard a woman sing. It was not a professional voice. It was simple and true. He leaned his forehead against the cool wall and closed his eyes. He had not cried in years. He cried then quietly, like a man who is out of practice. The man came back. He did not announce himself, and he did not enter. A bouquet of white daisies appeared by the door with no card. Claire found it on her way in and set it in a glass of water. When she looked up, the man stood across the hallway, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. He was embarrassed to be caught. He did not need to be. Claire smiled. "I am Claire," she said. He opened his mouth, and for a reason he could not name, he said, "David." "Nice to meet you, David," said Claire. She glanced at the bouquet. "They are her favorite." He blinked. "She used to keep a vase of them on the piano," he said. Claire nodded. "Would you like me to play something for her tonight?" "If you have time," he said. Their talk stayed small for a while. The weather had been rain, and then more rain. The coffee machine in the break room jammed every other day. Claire said she carried a sketchbook because drawing made time slow down until small things felt important. David listened with both hands in his pockets. He asked why she sang, even when patients did not respond. "Silence needs company too," she said, "like a porch light that you keep on." He looked at the floor and then at her. He wanted to tell her his name was not David. He wanted to tell her he was a son who had not learned how to be one. He did not. Instead, he said thank you, and left before the words inside him grew larger than he could hold. The night was slow. Claire checked on patients and refilled water and changed a bandage on a heel. Past midnight, she drifted in the chair by Martha's bed, and fell asleep with a blanket pulled at her ankles. The radio had gone silent. The rain had thinned to a soft mist on glass. The door to room 312 swung inward a few inches. Thomas stepped inside. He closed it again with care and stood very still. He looked at Claire where she slept with her cheek in her palm. He lifted the fallen blanket and tucked it over her shoulders. The gesture felt like a line he had never crossed. He moved to the bed and sat in the other chair. He watched his mother breathe. He waited to see if fear would rise and chase him out. It did not. He took out his phone and found a recording he had kept for years. It was a recording of his mother playing a simple march when he was 5, counting gently over the top of the melody. He did not press play. He set the phone down. "Mum," he said, and the word surprised him. His voice had grown deeper, and the word did not seem built for that pitch. He placed his hand on the blanket, near her hand. "I remember the smell of apples in the oven when it snowed. I remember the metronome. I remember that you tapped the piano when I missed the F sharp, and that you smiled after you scolded me if I corrected it. I remember the red purse you carried, and how it had a small rip in the lining that you never bothered to fix." He talked softly for a long time. He spoke the details that had survived in him, the ones that prove a life was shared, even when it felt empty. He did not say, "You left me." He did not need to. It hung between them, known and not cruel. He told her he was tired. He told her he was not a boy anymore. He told her he had stood outside too long. Claire woke near the end of it. She opened her eyes and did not move. She listened to a voice she had only heard in a handful of sentences say what most men do not say. When Thomas fell quiet, she lifted her head and sat up. He turned and saw that she was awake. His face did not reassemble into the calm he used with his staff. "Who are you?" she asked. He looked at his hands. "I am her son," he said. "My name is Thomas. I did not tell you because I was not ready to be that person yet." Claire nodded. She stood and stepped closer. She took his hand and placed it on top of Martha's. "It is not too late," she said. "It is only hard." He closed his fingers and felt the paper-thin skin of his mother's hand. He breathed. The room was quiet in a new way. Not empty, waiting. The next afternoon, the daycare called. Ava had a fever and needed to be picked up. Claire had 2 hours left in her shift, and the bus schedule was poor. She spoke to the nurse at the station and tried to think of who could help. Thomas came up the hall and saw her face change. He asked what had happened. She told him. "Let me drive," he said. "Are you sure?" "Yes." He drove a steady 10 minutes to the daycare. Claire went inside and came out with Ava, who had pink cheeks and heavy eyes. Ava raised her head from Claire's shoulder and looked at Thomas. "Is he your friend?" she asked. "Yes," Claire said. "Hello," Thomas said, and the girl's name came as if he had known it longer than a week. "Hi, Ava." On the way home, Claire thanked him until it embarrassed them both. He shrugged and said it was on his way. It was not. When they reached the apartment, he waited while Claire settled Ava. He was about to leave when Claire asked if he had eaten. He had not. She heated soup and cut bread, and they sat at the small table by the window. Plates did not match. The soup was a little too salty. It was a better meal than most restaurants. Ava appeared with a stuffed bear and a sheet of paper. She asked for a trick. Thomas looked at the paper and at the string that hung from a drawer where Claire kept thread and small tools. He folded slowly, creasing with care, and tied the string. He handed the paper kite to Ava. She ran around the living room, and the kite trembled and rose as if it believed the space above the couch was a sky. She laughed the kind of laugh that belongs only to the under five. Claire felt a knot in her chest loosen. When Ava fell asleep on the couch, Claire and Thomas talked in low voices. She told him how the first winter after Ava was born had felt like walking through fog. He told her about a graduation where he had looked up at the rows of parents and had not found his mother. When he stood at the door to leave, he said thank you again. Claire looked up at the paper kite caught on the ceiling light. Some things only fly in rooms like this, she said. That does not make them small. On a rainy morning, Claire brought her sketch of the piano and propped it on the table where Martha could see it. Ava sat calm for once on a chair and swung her legs. Thomas stood near the door with his hands in his coat pockets. Claire sang a simple tune as she wiped Martha's brow with a warm cloth. Ava set her small hand on Martha's hand and said, "Please wake up. We miss you." At first, nothing happened. Then Martha blinked. It was not the random blink of a dry eye. It was slow and planned. A tear formed at the corner of her eye and ran toward her hairline. Claire covered her mouth and then laughed from shock. Ava leaned closer and said it again. "Please wake up." Thomas moved without thinking. He came to the bed and went to his knees and took his mother's hand. "Mum," he said, and the word came easier than last time. Martha turned her head a little as if coming back from far away. Her lips moved. She shaped his name. Thomas. The monitor went on with its soft rhythm. The room held a stillness that felt like reverence. Claire pressed the call button and a nurse came and then a doctor. They tested responses. They spoke in measured terms. She is demonstrating awareness. She may respond to simple commands. We will begin focused therapy. When they left, Claire, Thomas, and Ava stayed where they were. Thomas kept his forehead on the back of his mother's hand. Claire stood behind him and set her palm on his shoulder. Ava placed her bear on the blanket and patted it as if the bear were a part of the ceremony. The rain kept its soft tapping on the glass. Changes came in small shapes, a longer glance, the tilt of a head, the faintest turn of the mouth. The therapists worked with Martha in short sessions. They moved her arms and asked her to follow the movement of a finger. They spoke to her and waited. Sometimes she nodded. Sometimes she did not. It was not a miracle. It was work that looked like patience. Thomas showed up more. He brought coffee for the night shift and pastries for the morning. He learned the names of the cleaners and the cook with the loud laugh and the nurse who sang along with the radio. He stopped taking calls in the hallway and left his phone in his pocket for longer stretches. He spent money where it mattered. The recreation room had new paint and warmer light by the end of the month. Then one day, a piano arrived. It was old but polished. The keys were not perfect. They were clean. Above the piano hung a black and white photo of Martha in her 20s. She was in a dress with a small waist and her eyes were closed mid-laugh. Her hands hovered above a piano in what looked like a church basement. There was no plaque. People did not need one. Residents gathered in the room like birds. Claire sat at the bench and pressed a simple chord. Sound filled the space and softened the edges of the day. An older man who wore a vest said he had not heard a live piano in years. A woman in a blue cardigan cried without shame. Martha was wheeled in and sat near the front. She looked at the piano, and something in her face cleared. Claire played a tune most people know without remembering where they learned it. Thomas stood behind her. He thought of the picture on the wall and his mother's hands, and what it means to grow old and still be yourself. He felt the idea that had ruled him for years begin to change. The idea that love was a test he had failed. The new idea was quieter and stronger. Love is a habit. It is many small acts done again and again. Spring came early. The staff decided to hold a small concert in the courtyard. Folding chairs were set in rows. Paper lanterns swayed in the light wind. A cart from the kitchen rolled out with lemonade and cookies. Families came in sweaters and jackets. The sun slid across the brick and lit up the edges of leaves. Claire took her place at the piano they had moved to the patio for the day. Thomas stood beside her with a guitar. He was not a good player, but he had practiced enough to keep time. Ava wore a blue dress and a clip that glittered like a small fish. She marched down the aisle with a basket of flower petals and tossed them in a serious way that made everyone smile. Martha sat in her wheelchair in the front row with a blanket over her knees. Her eyes were bright. They played songs that did not ask for skill. People hummed and sang along. When Claire began, "What a wonderful world," the courtyard went very quiet. The notes felt like stepping stones in a stream. When the last chord faded and the clapping started up, Thomas set his guitar aside and turned to Claire. He took a small box from his pocket. He did not kneel right away. He spoke first. "You gave my mother her voice back," he said. "Your singing did that. Your drawings did that. Your patience did that. But you gave me something too. You gave me a way to be a son again. You showed me that love can be a practice. Soup on a rainy night. Paper kites in a living room. A hand on a shoulder that does not move away. I want to build a life out of these small things with you. Will you marry me?" A sound left Claire's mouth that was half laugh and half cry. She covered her face for a second and then lowered her hands and nodded. "Yes," Ava shouted. "That means I get a daddy now, right?" The courtyard broke into warm laughter and applause. Thomas put the ring on Claire's finger. It was simple and clear. He leaned his forehead to hers. Behind them, the paper lanterns lifted and settled in the light wind. Martha lifted her right hand a few inches from the arm of the wheelchair. It trembled and then held. Claire reached and held it. Martha looked at Thomas. Her lips formed a word. Bless. Or perhaps yes. The sound was small and it filled the world. The year after the concert did not turn into a film. It turned into a life. Claire still worked shifts. Some days were long and some were longer. She took more day shifts so she could read to Ava at night. Ava started an art class and came home with paint on her elbows and stories about a boy who always drew trucks. Thomas learned to make breakfast that a 6-year-old would eat. He burned the pancakes the first 3 tries and then figured it out. He drove Martha down to the lake most mornings when the air was clear. He talked to her about a new project that used better insulation and about a young engineer he wanted to promote. She listened, and now and then she nodded. One morning she touched his wrist and said one soft word. "Son." He did not answer. He could not for a moment. He put his head down on the blanket and let the word go through him. Claire kept drawing. The recreation room filled with small frames, a cup with steam. A door left open and the square of sun on the floor beyond it. A pair of hands. Residents pointed to the ones they liked. A man with a cane said the drawing of the birch tree looked like winter when he was a boy in Michigan. Ava stood in front of that same drawing and told her mother that the little dabs of pale paint on the leaves were the part where the tree was still alive. Claire said yes. There were days that felt like setbacks. Martha had a fever in late autumn and slept for 2 days. Thomas forgot to return a call and lost a bid. Claire cried in the break room after a patient she loved died in the evening with no one to hold his hand but her. Ava woke twice a week with a nightmare about a storm and needed the hall light on. But the floor of their life held. They learned to share the weight. They learned to say, "I am sorry," and to say it early. They learned to say thank you for the ordinary things. Coffee placed on the counter, a dish washed before it was asked. The small trick of squeezing a hand twice to say "I love you" when a room was not a place for words. One warm night in late spring, after Ava fell asleep early with crayon on her fingers, they wheeled Martha onto the porch. The lake behind Willow Ridge was still the water the color of steel, turned warm by the last of the sun. The birch trees moved their thin leaves like whispers. A pair of geese traced a slow line across the water. No one spoke. Claire leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder. Thomas set his hand on his mother's shoulder and felt the slight lift of her breath. Ava stirred inside and settled again. A radio somewhere inside the building played a song through a thin wall, and the notes came like a distant memory of a dance hall. Thomas thought of the long hallway where he had stood for months. He thought of how cold it had felt, and how loud his heartbeat had been in his ears. He looked at the doorway to room 312 now, and it was only a doorway. He thought of the first time Claire had placed his hand on Martha's and told him to try again. He thought of the paper kite that still hung from a nail in the ceiling of Claire's living room because Ava refused to take it down. He thought of soups and late bills and early mornings. He thought of the piano and of his mother laughing in a photograph. He thought of how love had turned out to be a set of small skills learned slowly. The porch light came on and made a circle of gold around their chairs. Moths drifted through and then away. The air was warm and carried the smell of cut grass. Claire lifted her hand and found his. He laced his fingers through hers. Martha shifted, and her hand slid to cover both of theirs for a moment. They stayed like that without measuring the minutes. Somewhere a nurse laughed. Somewhere a phone rang and stopped. Somewhere the night began. None of them spoke. The silence did not ask them to. The silence sat with them like an old friend. In the morning they would return to dishes and medication and emails. The coffee machine in the break room would jam. Someone would ask Claire to cover a shift, and she would say yes or no, depending on what Ava needed. Thomas would sit in a meeting and say we can do better on this, and mean both the numbers and the way people were treated. Martha would keep working with the therapists to move her hand a little more, and on good days, she would try a word, and on great days, she would find one. There would be no grand news. There would be many small good things. A life made that way is not small. It does not make a headline. It makes a home. That summer they took a photo on the porch. Claire set the timer and ran to sit. Ava insisted they all hold the paper kite because it had to be in the picture too. Thomas balanced it carefully so it showed. Martha sat straight and looked at the camera with polite attention. The photo turned out a little crooked. The light was good. They printed it and put it on the wall near the door. When guests came in, that was the first thing they saw. People asked Claire sometimes how Martha was doing. She said it depends on the day. People asked Thomas how work was. He said the same. People asked Ava if she liked first grade. She said yes if there was recess. Then she told them about the paper kite as if it were an important person. On a day in late summer, a storm rolled over the lake, and the staff kept everyone inside. The power flickered and then held. The hallways filled with the sound of rain. Thomas brought the guitar into room 312. Claire sat at the edge of the bed. Ava stood and leaned on the rail. Thomas played 3 soft chords. Claire sang a tune they had sung many times. Martha turned her head toward the sound. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her eyes were full and clear. When the song ended, no one clapped. They did not need to. They sat and let the quiet come back and set itself down among them. When the storm moved off and light returned to the glass, the world looked washed. The birch leaves shone. The path across the lawn gleamed. The day went on. Not every story ends with a cure. Some end with new habits that hold, with a hand reached for and found, with the sound of a song that starts a little rough and then finds the note, with a small kite that flies only in a living room and that is more than enough, with a son who learned to walk through a door and stay, and with a woman who kept singing to keep the porch light on until everyone could see the house. They stayed. That was the miracle.